And now we have a very special guest joining us here, Colin Wright, the writer of Reality's Last Stand. He's an evolutionary biologist and writer of Reality's Last Stand, where he examines issues at the intersection of biology and society. With his scientific background, Colin brings a perspective rooted in biology, often challenging popular narratives around identity and science. Colin, welcome to the show.
I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's really exciting.
Yeah.
So, Colin, we must have had 5 or 6 team meetings getting ready for this, maybe 5 or 6. We talked a lot about this. And, I guess I want to be really honest with you. I feel, because it's like, I know we've talked about this. I feel so strongly that conversations with people, I don't want to say on the other side, but conversations with people that have questions or a different idea about policy, it is so necessary. Like this war where we are just screaming at each other and each side has its extremists, is not serving the public policy conversation. The risk, I think, today is, having someone like you on the show, if we just sit here the whole time and find the areas where we agree on, I really worry that's going to come off as like a complete rubber stamp on your entire political project, where I don't agree with you on everything. I also don't want to sit here and have like a Destiny style debate with you. So does that make sense to you? Like, what kind of conversation were you thinking we should have today?
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. I mean, I'm totally happy to talk about areas of overlap where we agree. I think those are often good places to, start to ground us to make sure that, we're not just sworn enemies. We have a lot of overlap in what we think should be done, how things are. And yeah, it's also fun to explore the differences. I mean, that's what I like the best. I used to sort of be in these clubs when I was in college, like these atheist clubs. And it was so boring to me because all we did is talk about the things we agreed on. It was just like, yeah, we're all atheists. We don't agree that God exists and all this stuff. And it's just like, what's the point of having a meeting of a bunch of people who just to talk about things we already agree on? So I always liked exploring the areas like, okay, we all agree on this one thing. Well, what are the things we disagree on? And now that we know, coming from a shared sort of place, we can explore those without offending people and things like that. So I think a little bit of both. Yeah, we need to have the overlap and then show where we disagree.
So my Twitter, I assume you follow Sky as well, and Taf and Kelly. Where, in your view, do you think you kind of agree with our political project? Where do you perceive the overlap as being?
I'm not too familiar with the other people as much as I am with you, Brianna. I see your stuff all the time in my feed. And I think where I agree with you most, the reason I find myself constantly hitting like on your posts is because you seem to be calling out more of an ideological turn that a lot of the trans movement has made in the last decade or so, that has sort of expanded what it means to be trans into just oblivion, where it's just encompassing common sex nonconformity and things like that. The existence of non-binary as a category, I think, reveals the ideological shift. I think that really shows sort of that it is an ideological thing. It's not just sort of the older, what we used to refer to as transsexuals, who are people who are understand their sex and who are just saying I'm really distressed and I want to take steps to appear as the opposite sex because this helps me move through the world comfortably. And that's something I have no issue with. Whereas now we have sort of this ideological shift that goes into a lot of pseudoscience about the sex, whether it's even real, whether it's binary or a spectrum, brain sex versus, sex of different body parts and brain body mismatches. So I think that's where I kind of saw things going wrong, was with the ideological shift.
So I just want to pause and make sure trans people can hear this. I want to repeat back what I just heard because I see you attacked on this so often. Yeah. So am I correct to understand that your position is someone like me who had clinical gender dysphoria, and as an adult, I went to a doctor, I got certified, and I went down a medical pathway to change my gender. You know what I mean, to live as a woman, right? To get HRT, to blend, to live in a way that felt authentic to me. Am I correct to understand you have you support that. You think that that is helpful. Is that the gist of it?
Absolutely. I think individuals should have the right to be able to do that when they're adults and can make these decisions and they know who they are. They tend to know what's best for them, especially if they're dealing with doctors who can walk them through this. As long as I think there should be some medical safeguarding. I don't think it should just be like, I want to just get these things, and then it's just like, well, here you go. And by the way, they're all covered by insurance, and there should be some level of safeguarding to make sure that people aren't going to regret what they're doing. That's why I kind of criticize the gender affirming framework, because it's really just no safeguarding. I think if we could shift back to how things were, where it was a process, and I think it should be a process. But I'm not against anyone doing these things, either if it's a medical process, having a really robust assessment, or if people want to pay out of pocket for things, I'm totally fine with people pursuing all sort of cosmetic changes to their bodies that I have no problem with. To me, my main focus is on children, mainly because of the severity of the changes that we're talking about. But
and I'll let other people go, but I just want to say really quickly, this is where I really, really agree with you. And I think my co-hosts do as well, because I strongly believe that medical safeguarding, I think the community has framed all of that as being oppression. And I don't think that that's true. I think this is really apparent in the AGP discussion. And I'm saying this not like any judgment of anyone with that, but not every single person with autosexuality needs to transition and is going to be served with that. I think they deserve a healthcare system where they will be able to sit down with a therapist that actually understands these concepts and can walk them through that and explore other things to find out if maybe there are things less extreme that would help them have a good life and alleviate that dysphoria. I think that avoiding the political problem of Chloe Coles coming along, I think that's very much in the trans public interest. So I think right there, we've got a lot of overlap.
No, Colin, I don't know if you remember me. I imagine you probably don't. I'm sure you have
at GenSpect. We met each other at GenSpect, right?
You do? Oh,
okay,
yes, we did.
Right. Yes.
I listened to your speech there, or your presentation about the value of biology when it comes to understanding how to shape law and all of these various things. They're just the fundamentals about human understanding. And I mean, I came up to you and thanked you for it, because I had no idea how pervasive it was that at universities, you weren't even being allowed to talk openly about these concepts of just basic biology, at least from my point of view. Yeah. And it's I am so against that freedom. Whenever I see that restriction of speech in an environment like academia, where we should be inviting contradictory opinions, that's how you reach truth. That's how you get closer to understanding the opposite of your side. It brings me back to John Stuart Mill, who makes that statement about one who only knows their side knows little of that. And I just think again of that is one of my core guiding principles. And it's I think that's where I see a lot of red flags with the trans ideology stuff kind of going off the rails, is exactly when you start seeing that protection of, oh, we can't have any discussion on this. It's scary. It's not going to help. It's going to, attack our own side. And so that was really eye-opening to me when you shared that at the GenSpec conference. And I was grateful that at least, we're gaining some traction in the discussions from that perspective. And my hope is that we'll see more of a overlap or a mutuality in having those conversations between, your perspective or the perspective of biology, and then seeing where that can intersect, people that maybe have an experience that seems a little bit, contradictory, or seems, it seems to put it at odds with some of those basic tenets.
Yeah. I mean, my main project has been trying to clarify the biology of sex on this issue, because that's what kind of got me out of my lab and posting on Twitter in the first place, is people saying wrong things about sex. And I feel like if we could all just get to a point where, as long as we're making sane noises about what the biology is, then we can actually talk about other aspects of transitioning and things like that. I just view a lot of what's happening now as people basing transitioning on these, frankly, pseudoscientific ideas of, literally being able to change your sex through certain things. And I think a lot of people, especially, younger people. I know, talking to Chloe Cole and stuff, like they literally thought in their mind that they could change their sex literally. And so I just think this sort of being misinformed is where I'm trying to focus my efforts.
But Colin, this is where I think my political project differs from yours, respectfully, because and this is a critique I have of you. I've thought about this so much this week that I understand. Like, I have no delusions. I am a natal male that has taken a course of like alterations to my body to appear female when I'm in public. I have no illusions about that. But what I think the gender critical conversation, the gender critical crowd does, is I think they take that simple reality, which I actually don't think as many people are confused about as you do. I disagree that most people think this. And I think you hyper focus on one area of this to make a whole host of arguments. And let's also not pretend that they don't use that fact to talk about us and frame us as though we're these hostile rapist invaders trying to take over women. And I think if you're like taking one scientific point and saying this is the only scientific point, well, I could do that right back to you. In fact, trans people do this all the time. What they'll say is, look, we've got these self-reported studies over here that show that, transition helps alleviate gender dysphoria. And you can show that all day long. And the science is very, very clear on this, that this will give someone, like, at least in the short term, a self-reported answer on the survey. I could come back to that and say, what, you want to deny that this science is real? You want to pretend this doesn't exist? How dare you? I just want to be here and have a scientific conversation. I can show you research all day long that shows if you call a trans woman he and don't affirm her, that this is psychologically damaging. Why are you trying to pursue a false scientific agenda? So I think, like, the science, there's a broad array of facts that as public policy professionals, we have to look at, not just this one thing. And I also think it's not the entire point. The point is not, are trans women biological women? That's not the question. It's, do trans women deserve dignity and access to the public comments? Because so much of the public policy being argued, I have to be honest, is so shockingly similar to the segregationist policies I saw advocated by elected officials in Mississippi in the 90s when I was growing up. So I think, like, I'm entirely happy to cede the scientific argument. What I want to get to is the public policy discussion, which is where I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think that's important. I tend to focus on the biological aspect, mainly because I think that it is sort of used as a premise for, everything seems to flow from that initial premise of sort of the sex spectrum and negating the sex binary. But yeah, I do agree that at some point, the real discussion is like, well, what do we do about it in public policy and things like that? That's where the sort of rubber meets the road. And this is where I like to distinguish between, biological sex, and clearly sex is also a legal category that we've placed around it. And so, how do these, how do we, correlate biological sex to legal sex, and maybe things like what counts as being a woman or a female for sake of sport. And I'm not necessarily under the impression that they should all be the same, even if there should be massive overlap between them all. I think, there are interesting things around the edges of where we can say, where can exceptions be made? And I think those are areas we should talk about potentially. And I'm not going to claim I have all of the answers to, and just like here's a perfect thing. I think sometimes we have to sort of deal with a situation that's sort of like the best, the least bad situation, because I don't think there's necessarily a silver bullet solution to a lot of things, but I think some solutions or proposed solutions are better or worse than others. So yeah, I'm happy to talk about any of those things for sure.
I want to let my other co-hosts speak.
Well, yeah, this is something that I talked about before you got in here. But my biggest worry was that we would end up agreeing on like too much in the discussion, because I am someone who has been like raising flags in the trans community for years about some of the shoddy science around specifically HRT for minors. And so I've been in like heated debates about this. And every time I've been like totally shut down by the trans community. Yeah. It's very frustrating because I feel like my community, and especially like the Democrats, have sort of decided that they're going to die on this hill. And that the science doesn't even need to be like explored more. Like it's just settled. There's no more debate. And, I don't think that's ultimately a message that's resonating with people. I think that parents really do see these detransitioners and they really do care. That affects them. And then they go and vote. And at the end of the day, I feel like I'm getting like deeply affected by this because people who claim to represent me, in politics, the left, are sort of failing to actually do their job of rigorously exploring what reality is rather than kind of pretending what they'd like it to be. So that's always been a frustration for me. I think at the same time, I think that I can imagine there being opportunities for minors to transition in the same way that I think I have a very similar perspective on adult transition to you, but I think for minors, I think that a huge problem is just the ability to actually conceptualize what they're doing and to properly consent to it. And to the extent that the studies kind of show like null results, there are like outliers within those studies who show positive results. So I think that there's maybe an opportunity for a rigorous gatekeeping process, something where medical professionals who are free from the political bias of, rubber stamping HRT prescriptions are allowed to truly interrogate, like, is this person a good candidate? And I don't know what age that might be, like 16 is something that gets thrown around a lot as far as like when that might be appropriate. That seems like plausible to me. I wonder, you as the expert on all this stuff, the biology, if you think that's possible or if you think it's just too fraught to potentially go down that road.
Yeah, it's really difficult because we can see that the existence of people who are adults and who've transitioned and who are happy with their transition and remain transitioned for their entire lives. I think a lot of people can say that like this person would have probably benefited if they could maybe pass more, if they had been able to transition at a younger age before they got these differences from puberty. I think that is a true statement. But the difficulty is that just because some of these people would have benefited, this sort of sets the stage for people to want to go back and say like, well, how can we identify these people before puberty at a young age in order so we can make sure that we get those people. But the difficulty is that while it's easy to look back in hindsight to say that like, I'm somebody who would have benefited from this, it's really, really difficult and really, really inaccurate to have a pool of 11, 12-year-olds and be able to predict with really, really high accuracy which ones are going to be those ones that are happy with it through the rest of their lives.
Do you really think so, Colin? Because if you go look at the DSM standards, like it's been lowered to 2 out of 6 criteria, 2 out of 6, which is just insane to me. And like, if you go read the standards from 1998, we'll put it in the show notes. It was such a higher standard. So I actually think like we do know a lot about what boys that want to be girls look like. Like there are case studies of a very typical transsexual like journey. And I do imagine that if you get the politics out of this, like I do think there's a way to go and do really good studies and move back to these older standards and stop like someone that has 2 out of 6 criteria. I do not support them transitioning as a minor. If someone's got 6 out of 6 and they're going through a major depressive episode and they have an eating disorder because they're trying to make themselves thin because they're terrified of like, masculinizing and, they've got suicidal ideation, I think symptomology indicates treatment. And to me, that is a much stronger argument for intervention at that point.
Yeah, I mean, it depends where we want to draw a line on, how much bycatch collateral damage are we willing to accept in here? How many kids are we willing to unnecessarily and wrongfully transition that would make them sterile in order to capture all the individuals who who would receive a benefit, and how much is the harm that's done to those who are done wrongfully? How much is that harm offset by the benefits that is done by those who go through it and are ended up happy with it?
And then there's the opposite argument, like how many trans children becoming someone who cannot pass and are going to have really difficult lives. What human cost of that is okay? How many trans children, like I went to rehab, I have no idea how I didn't die from all the drugs I took. How many kids with like a major depressive episode that commit suicide, like Leila Alcorn? How many of those kids are we willing to lose? And like, I think some of the framing I find so frustrating is where we always talk about like the cis children that may not get the perfect outcome that they want as the focus. And the trans lives are kind of talked about like they're disposable. And it feels really dehumanizing to me, if that makes sense.
Well, I feel like if anything, at least in the trans community, the focus is fully like on the trans kids.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like very rare for those detransitioners to even enter into the conversation. I do think within the medical profession, there's a very like natural lean or inclination towards not taking an intervention if you can potentially avoid that. And we're talking about like false positives and false negatives. I mean, if the doctor is going to prescribe HRT, they're taking on like a big responsibility, I think, ethically, for the results of that. And so if you do get these detransitioners, that seems to be really bad in a way that, like, you know, adults, they can take on all of that moral, ethical responsibility, or at least most of it themselves. Yeah. And so with kids, it's a hugely different environment.
Do you not think like a huge piece of it might be how some of these therapists that, in my opinion, are extremely underqualified and barely have any experience, borderline don't even have a degree, are able to diagnose these kids with gender dysphoria, when I feel like it should be left up to probably more like psychiatrists and people that have a little more experience?
Yeah, well, I think the main issue is with the gender affirming model of care that is, you know, basically doesn't have these safeguards. It's essentially, you know, if the kid identifies as a certain way, then that's how they identify. There's not really a lot of pushback that can happen with respect to someone making these certain claims. And you know, we do have an issue in the culture too, because we have, if you look at the medical community, it is, especially in trans medicine, it's filled with gender affirming practitioners. It's also in the culture, it's in the water, as you know, to whatever degree it can be called a social contagion, just adopting these trans identities because of the ideological shift that we've experienced. I think I really don't trust the community right now, given the state of the medical field and the state of the culture, to do a really good job assessing any type of kid to any reliable accuracy who is going to reliably, you know, remain transition for their whole life. And then there's also a philosophical issue of, you know, it's impossible to do like the blinded studies on this to know that, like, okay, maybe this one person is transitioned and they remain transitioned and happy through their lives, but you can't see how happy they would have been if, say, they didn't, if they maybe would have desisted, because there is this sort of inertia that a social transition has, puberty blockers has, cross-sex hormones, they kind of lock people in, make it more difficult for people to desist. And so it's hard to control for that, to know that, you know, maybe they would have been happy either way. And, you know, all else being equal, if they would have been happy without transitioning, well, now that at least they have their fertility in this other scenario too. So it's really difficult. I mean, it's so difficult with kids. That's why my personal view is that we shouldn't be doing puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to adolescents, and it should be reserved for people who are 18 or older. But they still deserve. You would completely
ban it for all, even MTFs, even though they have a much lower issue rate.
I would have it for people who turn 18, and even when you're 18, you deserve to have, you know, actual assessments. It shouldn't just be gender affirming.
A total ban. You're for a total ban on this 100%. No exceptions. Parents do not have the right to, they've got a child, major depressive episode, suicidal ideation, has been saying they want to be a girl since they're 3. They hit puberty. They're terrified. Their body is becoming like a linebacker. You want a total ban in that case.
For minors, I do. I don't think the evidence is in there that shows that this is a reliable will reliably improve their
you
lives.
think all the like we've got Kelly and Taf here today. They seem pretty
I
happy.
don't think
I get what you said
either.
because sometimes I think about, if I'm very happy with my transition and where I'm at in life. I don't see myself ever detransitioning, but I'd be lying if I didn't say, like, a piece of me sometimes thinks, wow, if I wasn't given testosterone blockers at 15, like, would I have grown out of it by the time I was 18? I don't know. Probably not, in my opinion. But how much of that is because I was on those blockers and because I'm on estrogen now and because I'm post-op? Like, I don't know how my mind has been affected because of those things, even though I do feel like I have a very happy, successful life now. So yeah, but it's a catch-22 for me too, because then I also think, well, what if it didn't like go away and I still felt that way into my adulthood, and then I would have developed even more and I would have passed less. And unfortunately, it just kind of seems like in this society, the more you pass, the better you're treated, the more respect you get. And even now, when I feel like I somewhat pass, I feel like I still get treated like shit and judged for how I look. So I can only imagine how much worse it would be if I had to develop more. So it just sucks because I don't really know what the answer is, because there's no like magical test to like tell if you're trans or not. And I really wish there was, because I feel like it would like solve so many of these issues.
Yeah, so I don't deny that there's individuals who do benefit in the long term. Like there's an issue with pointing to individuals and saying, well, what about this person? You would have told them they couldn't. It's like, well, if we're talking about like a medical protocol and what we do, we can't just base it on someone I know who would have benefited from it. There has to be good, evidence of long-term outcomes.
But it feels like there's a double standard that you're applying here, where a trans child is just acceptable losses, meat for the machine. Like, I feel like, I don't mean to be emotional, but it's really hard to hear the way people talk about us. Like, our lives don't matter. And, I could point to 20 drugs right now that went through and got to market because there was a lot of money in there for a pharmaceutical company in bringing that to market, where the science showed the efficacy was not so great. Oh, the one for female arousal. To increase that. It's a statistical blip. This is not a great drug. It's amazing it went to market. But we look at that and like we weigh those outcomes, like this is going to help more people than it hurts. And those drugs come to market. There are all kinds of things in medicine that have much more shaky efficacy than gender affirming medicine. So I feel like rather than going to this this extremist solution that takes those options out of parents' hands, what I think the right solution is, I fully agree with you, Colin. WPATH getting radicalized in the last 10 years is the worst thing that has ever happened to my community. It is terrible. You're 100% right. That's a bunch of fringe leftists with crazy ideas. This expansion of giving surgery to people with non-binary, I have looked up and down for any justification that giving a biological male that thinks they're non-binary breast implants and a full beard and letting them go on estrogen, becoming this thing in the middle, leads to any good healthcare outcome, which our tax dollars pay for. I don't think this science exists, yet the DSM has been rewritten to encourage that. So it seems to me that rather than going to this government overreach solution, the answer lies in looking at those standards. I think WPATH should be the central public policy battlefield.
From what I've seen, I don't think that there is really convincing evidence that we can reliably know which kids are going to have the long-term benefit of these interventions. So that's why I draw a line right there. And I do have one, I guess, area of pushback I would say is I personally tend to avoid, and this is a kind of a controversial area, but I've talked to Leor Sapir a lot about this. There's a tendency to use the word like trans kids and refer to these people as like something that they are. They're like, this is a trans kid as something very distinct from a kid who isn't trans. And I tend to favor using the word trans or the modifier trans to mean, someone who's actually taken steps to like transition, because I think this labeling kids really young as trans is sort of sets them apart from other kids, where I think, they should they're flagged as, potentially someone who will transition later in life. But it's impossible to know which of those kids are going to be will become that category of trans. And which
But don't you see how that argument then continues to people like me? Because then you've got TERF Twitter, which calls me a trans-identified male. I'm a natal male. That's just a fact. But I'm a trans woman. That's what trans women call ourselves. Like, the game here is to frame me as male, to demean me, and to push a public policy discussion where I'm segregated from society. So I don't have an issue with doing that with children. It's just like, you have to think about where the next step is, if that makes sense to you. But I want to come back to this. Like, I really, again, I'd love an answer on this. Why to you? Like, let's say, I'll be very generous and say it is 5 trans kids out of 100 regret it. It's not that, as best as I can tell, like male to female trans kids. The female to male, I want to get them just out of the cohort completely. Testosterone is so powerful, you can wait till later. But why is that 5 children who may regret it, which is a very high number, more important than the 95 that are going to feel like their lives are better? Because I think that number, if you reversed it, how many of those children are going to feel like their lives are worse from not transitioning? Like, why does one count? Why do trans lives not matter and the cis lives do? That's what I don't understand.
Well, I think all lives matter, but I don't think we have good data to suggest what the desistance rates actually are at the moment. I mean, we have so much loss to follow up from all the studies that are performed. If we had an accurate assessment, I think if we could have really clear data, and I know the Manhattan Institute has a lot of data that they've been able to purchase, and they're working through making as more accurate reports as we can possibly do on this.
Sure.
To find out what those rates are.
So, I will say it's 49 and 51. Okay, 49 kids desist and regret. 51 trans kids feel like it benefited them. Why, in that scenario, would the trans kids not matter and the cis kids would? That's what I don't understand. Yeah.
Interpret a little bit with this. I think what I'm hearing, Colin, and like, correct me if I'm hearing this incorrectly, it seems like right now we just don't have strong evidence for any meaningful positive effect within trans kids. So we've got like survey data. We've got some studies that are showing like very small effects that are beneficial. And so we're hearing this rhetoric, like even from Brianna, where you're talking about like depressive episodes and suicide. We don't have evidence that like HRT lowers suicide risk in trans kids. We don't have that evidence. And we do have evidence that HRT causes sterilization and causes irreversible body changes. And all of that is very well understood. But the benefit is very, it's kind of nebulous. It's hard to pinpoint. And it's for so many methodological reasons. It seems like when you're given that opportunity, all these kids who maybe will benefit from transition, and then you're talking about like this large 49% like desistance rate, it seems like the responsibility of the medical provider is to not intervene and potentially make something worse. I don't know if that's like a fair assessment. Colin, feel free to add on to that, but I think that's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, I mean, it has to do with the severity of the interventions. I mean, we're going to have, wrongfully sterilize, half of the people who are going through this. That's a major thing. These are totally irreversible. And while I understand that going through puberty for someone who's eventually going to, consistently identify as trans is also potentially irreversible. There are people who are trans who do pursue certain surgeries and hormones that do change parts of their body. It's more difficult. I will admit it's not that it's easy to be a trans woman and it's going to be an easy time and it's just as good at trying to make cosmetic changes after the fact. Like that's clearly, it's really difficult. But I would say that if we're going to have some sort of intervention, we have to have a pretty reliable evidence that this is going to be overwhelmingly beneficial rather than harmful. And permanent changes to children mixed with sterilization, that's just a really hard hump to get over to say, you say, yes, we should be doing this to kids. I mean, it's one of those situations that the least bad situation, because, you know, until we have a better idea of desistance rates, and you know, if we could have a crystal ball where we could know which kids are never going to regret it from a very early age, you know, that's something I'd be open to. I'd say, okay, if we can know for sure, but we can't, and right now we really have no really good idea of what the level of desistance rates, especially because of the ideological shift we've recently experienced.
Would you admit that pragmatically, let's say tomorrow you get your way, President Trump takes you up like you asked him to on Twitter to put you in charge of this policy, you enact a total ban on children transitioning. Would you acknowledge that the very first thing they are going to do is to go on, like, estrogens, not difficult to synthesize, and anti-androgens, you're not going to get drugged to sniffing dogs to find anti-androgens. Like, you would admit that just like abortion and women going into back alleys, the first thing that's going to happen is those kids are going to turn to Dr. 4chan. And they're going to start getting their health care online, and there's not going to be an endocrinologist. There's not going to be anyone there to like put a medical safeguarding in place, something you and I both agree on. Like, you will agree that those kids are still going to experiment medically. There's just not going to be a provider in the mix, right?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine some people will resort to doing extreme things for sure, but I don't think we should make our policy, you know, around the fact of what people are going to do on their own or what they might have access to. I think we need to have evidence-based policy first and foremost, and hopefully we can get those people other care that they might need, so that they wouldn't maybe pursue these other avenues.
I think
we need to have a grandfather clause as well.
I don't know. I think it's like abortion. Yeah. To be honest, well, I mean, not to disagree with you, Brie, but like, I mean, it's kind of like saying, you know, like, oh, well, rapists are going to rape anyway, so like, why make it illegal? It's because it's like, you know, there are always going to be people who are going to go against the law or go to extreme measures to do certain things. But I get, like, it's different when we're talking in the aspect of healthcare. But it's like I just think this conversation kind of sucks because, you know, more kids are going to do those extreme things because we've made the whole trans topic so public and it's being discussed in schools and it's all over the media now. And I just feel like the trans visibility movement has almost harmed us more because now it's just now more kids, like, I've said it like a million times. It used to be a kid would like say they feel like a girl if they were a little boy, and now they're just going up to their parents or teacher and saying, "Oh, I'm trans," because they know what that is now, and it's like taught to them. So I don't know. I feel like it's almost just kind of like fucked us over in a way.
And Kelly, even on that, like, because these kids are hearing this rhetoric, like, you are going to kill yourself unless you transition.
Oh yeah,
right. And I told my parents that I thought I would kill myself when truly I don't know if I would have killed myself if I didn't go on HRT. But a huge reason my conservative parents let me go on HRT is because I told them that. And truly, if they still told me no, I don't think I would have been suicide. I don't think I have the ability to kill myself. I just don't think I'm that different.
I mean, so much
wonder if when Brady is that, it's like,
it just resonates.
Is that going to like make other kids just say these things so they can get what they want? You know what I mean? Like, not like saying you, but I'm just saying like the trans community as a whole, like pushing that. It's almost like telling kids to say these things in order to get what they want in a way.
Or telling these kids that, like, if their parents say no, then you do need to go on 4chan and like get whatever HRT you can. So I think
I just want to clarify, I do not support going on 4chan. Just to be clear, I'm just saying it's going to happen. So,
but I think that because the conversation has become so elevated and so extreme, we have like, you know, if we're worried about kids going on 4chan, I think that also probably contributes to that, this feeling that like, oh my God, you know, the science is settled. If I don't start HRT, I'm dead, I'm gone. And like earlier, we were talking about kind of understanding transition retroactively. And like Kelly, I don't necessarily know if it would have been like the worst thing if I never transitioned. Like, you know, I recognize that I'm an outlier in this. I always, you know, put that on the table, but I think I probably would have been okay not transitioning, and, you know, just living as kind of like AGP man. And so, I mean, that's like hard to acknowledge. And I think that like, if I had not transitioned, I would have always had this burning feeling of like, oh, if I just transition, everything will be like great in my life. But I think if I had like not transitioned in a hypothetical world where I also know where I end up having transitioned, and I would have been able to like sate that curiosity and just say like, okay, that's how I would feel psychologically, then I think I could probably not transition and be okay. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the ability to like transfer information between timelines, but I do feel like so much of my transition, like, you know, candidly, Colin, you don't know this, but I transitioned, came out when I was like 14. So I transitioned very early. And a lot of the rhetoric that I was hearing from doctors was like, you know, you just need to do this and like it'll fix pretty much everything in your life. That turned out not to be the case. Now, would I say transition had like bad effects for me? No, not necessarily. Like I would say it's overall maybe like a slight positive, but it also cost a lot. So I don't think, even in my case, I don't think it's like a clear cut, you know, positive or negative example.
Yeah, I'll raise one thing too, is that has to do with sort of the social contagion of suicide. And if you look, I think it's GLAAD and even the ACLU and other sort of the human rights campaign, they used to issue these documents of how to talk about suicide. And it used to be very clear that, you know, don't attribute, you know, suicide to any particular exogenous event like a legislation or something like that, because suicide is an enormously complex thing. And if people are saying that like, oh, these people committed suicide because of this one thing over here, because of a legislation, this sort of, you know, given the social contagion of suicide, makes people more likely to commit suicide when certain laws are passed. And we have this complete flip of the narrative now, where you have HRC, you have GLAAD, who are talking specifically about like, you know, what to do if you're feeling suicidal because of this new, you know, law being passed. And this is just completely counter to what they're doing. And so, yeah, there's a suggestion that kids who, you know, if they're going to the black market to get, you know, DIY HRT and stuff because they're so concerned that they're going to commit suicide, like, some of that is because of, I think it was the narrative around suicide and how it's become seen as almost like a reasonable thing to do, or just like an inevitable outcome of not receiving these things. So
I fully agree with you. And I want to see the conversation. Like, I really hope I'm not coming across here as the person that's like, all gas and no brakes with gender transition is not my intention. I fully agree with you. These stories of saying your kid's automatically going to kill themselves, utterly unhelpful. We need to stop that today. I guess it's just like, when I'm thinking about the public policy that we have to develop, it's really hard if you're saying, like, don't talk about the suicidal ideation. Like a kid getting a gun, or like Leela Alcorn throwing themselves in front of an 18-wheeler. That's not the only way that these like self-destructive tendencies exhibit themselves. It's with sexually risky behavior. I mean, how many trans women have AIDS? Colin, you've published these stories over at Reality's Last Stand. Risky sexual behavior, eating disorders, drug addiction, depression. Like a kid killing themselves is not the only way that this is expressed. And I think it's not, if I'm saying like the risk of DIY stuff, that's not to like come there and scaremonger. It's because I'm trying to ask everyone here to consider if we're going after the right target. What all of us I'm hearing here want today is we want all of us here, we want questions to be able to be raised. We want children to get the message that if they're transition, like they may not, it's not as catastrophic as the worst scenario is telling you. And we want them to be able to explore options. I think all of us want the activists out of trans healthcare today. And I think all of us want to raise those standards. I think the difference that I'm hearing is what the correct vehicle is to explore those changes that all of us agree on. And I just disagree that a total ban is the way to go. I think looking at the medical practitioners and the ultra low politicized standards, that just pragmatically makes sense to me, because the DIY stuff is so easy to access today. And hand to God, I can think of no way to regulate this. I can't. Like cryptocurrency, you're not going to make cryptocurrency go away. You can't intercept this stuff at the border. I mean, how are you going to stop this from happening? Like pragmatically, I can't think of a way.
Well,
and just to back you up,
so I'm for a total ban on, you know, on minors, but I don't think that does necessarily mean I'm for like a total ban on, you know, these types of procedures completely for adults. And I think 18 is, I mean, I remember when I was 18, that's still pretty damn young. I don't think saying that I'm for a total ban, at a certain
children,
age cohort, but yeah. So that's
what would
my,
that be? Would that be 18 or 25?
It'd be 18.
Okay.
I'm curious, do you know, have those suicide numbers gone up? Because I just wonder if they have, like, how much of it has to do with, like kids just being exposed to the idea of transition being possible.
Yeah.
Because like, not to like reiterate my point, but I just feel like we gained so much more when people weren't aware that this was possible, and it was only something they did when they knew they had to do it, and it was the last resort. So when we tell kids at like 6, 7 years old that like, oh, you can transition, this is possible for some people, be accepting, it almost like tells them, oh, I need to do this, and it almost like makes those suicidal ideations and thoughts like come a lot more often than they are supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about?
So from what I've seen, suicide rates, they've been going up across the board just in general for younger people. But this is, correlates with the general increase in mental health issues for young people. And it's really difficult to disentangle. Is it because they're identifying as trans, or do they have mental health issues before that sort of causes them to identify as trans later? It's kind of hard to know which, where the causal factors lie. I think there has been increase in sort of suicidal, ideation, but the actual rates of suicide, I don't think have gone up specifically, when you control for things like comorbidities and mental health issues and things like that.
But social anxiety, we know that's skyrocketing. I'm pretty sure like drug addiction rates, they are going up, across the board. So I think it would probably be reasonable to expect a lot of that is happening for trans people as well.
Yeah. It depends if it's because they're trans, or is it because of the, co-occurring mental health issues? Is it just a result of the mental health things, or is it innate to their,
and that's why I want to get these healthcare providers there. I mean, something you've talked about a lot on Reality's Last Stand, which I had never thought about, is this tie between autism and transition. And I used to just think about this like, oh, that's just a trans girl with autism. And I today think like something fundamental, like these girls are, I don't mean this in a bad way, they're just different than I am. Like their motivations are different, their culture is different, the way they behave is different. Like I think we would be so served by like unpacking those comorbidities and giving everyone more space to explore that stuff. I think one of the most dangerous aspects of the activists kind of getting the reins to healthcare is there's not a willingness. Like there's a system that transition and it's going to fix all your problems, rather than going, okay, you've got social anxiety disorder to the point where you can't go outside. Maybe we need to work on this at the same time, or a drug addiction at the same time. Like I just think like the comorbidities, you can't transition if it's not from a place of stability. Right? It's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. And I think that we're just serving people into the machine, as is evidenced by the way the community behaves, which is just deranged a lot of the time.
Yeah. Have you heard of minority stress hypothesis, Brianna?
I have, yes. But tell our viewers what this is. Yes.
So it's commonly used rather than sort of people who have a lot of social anxiety and whatever, being more likely to be drawn to the sort of ideologies or something of the modern trans movement. It tends to view it just the opposite. It views all of the distress, everything through the lens of, oh, it's because society is treating them poorly because they're trans, and that, oh, if they only transition, then like all of these things would be alleviated. I mean, even Jack Turpin even said that the high autism rates among people who are trans is part of the whole minority stress type of thing. It's not really autism. And so, I mean, it's really an all. Yeah. It's kind of this idea that is completely unfalsifiable, because it's you can't test it. It explains everything, therefore it explains nothing. And any tests of the hypothesis have just not shown anything to be true, or if they have, it's through sort of a wonky interpretation of the data. This is something Lior has written about on my Substack before.
Wow. Colin, I have a question for you that is really leaning into your biology background, just because I like how you approach it with that. So I also am very similar to Taf in that I see the typology framework as useful or helpful for me. And when I made decisions about my transition, I identify with the autosexual type. That's something that I have experience with, and I think was directly kind of, feeding into my gender dysphoria and what were some of the motivators for my transition. And I was not a child transitioner. I transitioned at 25. I just sort of won the genetic lottery in a way and was able to make this sort of work. And I do appreciate the fact that I had time to help come to my conclusions and my decision making, as I feel like it's given me a lot more confidence in just kind of how to view transition as a solution for me to move forward and live a better life, and rather than like changing my sex or anything like that. And so I guess what I want to go with is, when it comes to sexual orientation and sexuality, I think like what I've gained or what I've seen is that most consensus seems to be it's a process that happens in utero. But I want to hear from you about how that process, sort of how you understand it to work. And to that point, is there any sort of evolutionary advantage to experience attraction to yourself, or in my case, attraction to yourself as the opposite sex? And like, why could that happen from like an evolutionary standpoint?
Oh, that's interesting. So from what I know, the literature on the development of sexuality is something that is done in utero. There's also somewhat of a genetic component, but it's kind of the wiring of your brain, because there's surges of testosterone at different levels in utero that like males will experience that females won't. And we know that if you survey a bunch of people who are lesbians, you do brain scans on them, their brains are slightly more androgenized, and so which means have responded to higher levels of testosterone. They have sort of these finger digit ratios that are exemplify sort of higher levels of testosterone. Women who have polycystic ovary syndrome and their bodies are producing more levels of testosterone, they tend to be, not all of them, but they tend to be more same-sex attracted as well. So, hormone exposure does have a developmental role in who people are attracted to. It's kind of different. I think androgenization, predicts, being attracted to women, to the female body type, but it's not exactly the same with males. It's not, have a sort of feminized or non-androgenized makes you more likely to be gay, or though I think it is a little bit, but it's not quite as clear cut as just like direct exposures to androgens makes people more likely to be attracted to females in development. So it appears to be an innate feature, just your sexuality, that you will eventually be. It's interesting to think about whether something like AGP is its own unique sexuality that's sort of exists on the spectrum of, being straight or being gay. There might be something else going on there. I mean, I've known that there have been some brain scan studies where there's an area in the brain. I'm terrible with like names of the brains, but my friend Sam Stagg has reviewed a lot of these studies. And it's an area of the brain that has to do with like self-perception and things like that. And that tends to be larger in individuals who are like the AGP, the heterosexual, transsexual cohort.
Oh, really? That's so interesting.
Yeah. It's the same area in the brain. It's the same area in the brain that has to do with like people who are anorexic. It's sort of, they see themselves as one way, but they feel some other way, and it's really interesting. Yeah. It's kind of it's what you might expect. It's kind of like a holy crap, like this makes sense in a developmental sense. As far as like an evolutionary explanation for AGP, I'm not sure if I could come up with. I mean, it's so rare that it's in the realm of, variation is out there. There are some, not every trait can be, coughed up to an adaptationist view. Some traits are just kind of, they exist in the population because they're correlated with other traits. So I'm not convinced that it is even an adaptive trait or how exactly that could be adaptive. I mean, I'd have to think about it to come up with a scenario, but it would be I'd have to work on it and to come up with a reliable thing that made sense.
I definitely have like crazy theories on that for sure. But
we can chat about those if you want.
Yeah, well, just on that, I mean, for most of human history, having AGP does not necessarily entail like a medical transition or sterilization because you don't have access to these hormones. So it's not necessarily something that we'd expect to be like strongly selected against, especially if AGPs are also historically having sex with women. So it seems like plausible to me that it can exist in that evolutionary context. So, yeah.
So is it one further extension to that is I've seen some people say that your sexuality kind of like, I guess in utero is like the basis of it, but then it is kind of continuously hardwiring up until puberty. What are your thoughts on that? Does it continue through like early childhood? Is there any possibility for environmental mechanisms to, shape that further, or is it really more in utero?
I mean, there's always going to be some environmental play that goes on. Before, puberty and things like that, before people are beginning to be sexually active, before they're attracted to anyone, consciously or anything, it tends to be exhibited in just sex non-conforming behavior. Like you'll get sort of more masculine behaving girls and more feminine behaving boys. That's not to say that every masculine girl or feminine boy is going to grow up to be gay, but they by and large do. A large proportion of them will. And so, but it isn't until they get to reach puberty and they start, their gonads start activating that sex nonconformity extends itself to the realm of sexuality, where they're also sex nonconforming in their sexual preferences. That's kind of how it tends to manifest. Through development. It's just sex nonconformity, and then that just sort of extends to their sexual preferences later on.
Right. So you can see it in the behavior. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you.
So I have a question. How politically, just getting, one of my things is I try to be very pragmatic. Where do we go? I'm very much a ABC project manager. How do we get down the list? And I think very often, with this stuff, we tend to talk about our ideals and we don't really talk about how we get there. So when it comes to taming the extremism of the trans movement, I've got a plan, right? It's Dollcast is part of this, bring more moderate viewpoints out there, dedicate more of my, media public presence to getting moderate perspectives out there. I'm working on a Washington Post piece right now on this, to present a different side so that trans women don't only have to go into this fringe left community, right? That's my plan to turn down the conversation. I'm looking for a place to go with people to do that with me. Over on your side, I want to be clear, I don't think you're against us. I do think your audience, generally speaking, has, more people that are critical of trans people than, say, I do. So, what concretely or what role do you think you have to kind of get the conversation to be more productive? Or do you think you don't have a role?
No, I have a role. I mean, that's what I've been trying to do by highlighting. I've written articles in the Wall Street Journal about, the dangerous denial of sex and sort of issues with gender ideology more broadly. I've been trying to just raise awareness of the problems that I see out there, because the first step was just sort of this consciousness raising effort. I think that has largely been successful and consciousness has been raised quite a bit.
I agree.
The next step had been sort of, okay, well, now that people know the issues that are going on, well, what do we do? What are the issues? How is this happening? Oh, we'll look at WPATH. Oh, look at all these organizations that have been essentially captured by this certain ideology that is, producing all this stuff, refusing to analyze their own biases, and try to get people who are in these organizations, who we know through a lot of emails that they feel like they're being muzzled behind the scenes. So try to get people to be able to speak up and actually, hold the activists' feet to the fire about evidence-based medicine in these areas, so that they can, we can actually look at evidence rather than just ideology. But
would you not agree that there's a political project out there to basically that goes the other way? Like you can see that gender criticals have their own extremist policy project, right? So I guess my question is, what role do you think you have? What concrete actionable steps how do we get to, I understand, like, I agree with your entire mission there for the trans side. Over on the gender critical side, what are the steps you think people like you that do believe in dignity for trans people, what would your approach be to kind of getting them to go, come on, like, let's not talk about a total ban here. There's no need to dehumanize people. Like, we all need, like, respect here. What role do you think you have to play in calming that down?
Yeah, I mean, I try to do that a lot, and I get attacked from the GC ultras. That's what they're calling themselves a lot now. And I've had to go on massive blocking sprees because I did like a podcast with Julia Malott, and then they just post pictures. It's just like, oh, Colin and his pet troons or whatever. They just go, they just I'm friends with Sarah Higdon, and then I just get things that's like, oh, like Colin is this catching them all like Pokemon. It's just ridiculous. And they think that, they go hard against me, and I just try to say, no, these are people who are my friends, and I treat them as individuals because that's how I treat all my friends. I just try to, I guess, live as the example of someone who shows people dignity based on being an individual. And I hope others do the same. And if I see people attacking a trans woman just because they're trans or something out in public, I push back against that. I mean, I think I try to shame people on that side too, because I don't think we should be, shaming anyone for just expressing themselves in the public and, presenting themselves as the opposite sex or whatever. I mean, I just treat people as individuals, and I have a lot of trans friends, and I love them all, and I don't. I consider you a friend.
I do. I know it's going to piss people off, but I like you a lot. No, I hear you. So it's less of a public policy solution and more.
Yeah, I don't know if that can be done with policy. People can be assholes. I don't know how you legislate against assholes. It's just.
Well, I mean, but it's the W path. Like, that's what it comes back to me. Like, what are the standards that we are applying to this? That's like a very concrete public policy play that I want to do there. So I don't know. I think there's I wish there was a way to. How can I say this? I find it so consistently frustrating because there are reasonable TERFs and gender criticals. I talk to them every day, and they're like, look, they're exactly like you. They're like, I don't want trans women in sports. I have no issue with someone like getting married and having a life and using the bathroom, right? That's just a different thing. I'm talking about these, this, I don't want to see a penis in a locker room. And I really wish there was a space to elevate those voices at the public policy level, because I think if people like me are sitting down with people like you and them, I think that's where this insanity ends, in my view.
I agree. That's why I like to come on shows like this, and I'll still continue talking to trans people on their shows and try to just be the example, I guess, best I can.
Right. It's so hard to do, but I think that's like so necessary that some people are able to do that just to turn down the temperature and actually get to like a more reasonable conversation. Because like at the end of the day, like maybe I do think that there should be some pathway for adolescent transition, if it's like 16 with rigorous standards, but I've like only come to that conclusion through analyzing and like raising flags about the evidence. And a lot of trans people are not willing to like have that conversation with me whatsoever. Because I'm like, a lot of this evidence is kind of shaky. Like maybe we need to reevaluate and do all these things. And they just like write me off as like a crazy person. And then I've also tried to talk to like gender critical and TERFy people. And I've had them just like totally be like, it's cliche, but like just very like hateful, just like totally writing me off because of my identity. And that's frustrating because I feel like just no one is being benefited from this. And it like breaks my heart to hear these like detransition stories and to see how people are failed by doctors. And I just don't want that to happen. And at the same time, I want for like doctors to be able to make actual decisions based on evidence. And it feels like there's so little opportunity to just like talk to reasonable people who agree with that.
Yeah. Do you think WPATH needs to just, do you think we need to have people in the middle building a new WPATH? Because that's almost where I am. Your own organization has written plenty about the WPATH files when they came out. Yeah. Extremely disturbing stuff. And, I remember when I transitioned on the Benjamins, and I remember when WPATH started, and I was like, oh, this is a really good thing. This is going to standardize this and pursue more science. And I think it's unfortunately true that it's a fringe left progressive organization that is more about advocacy for a leftist point of view than it is pursuing science. I mean, do you think that just needs to be rebooted? Do you think it needs to be ignored? What is the process to get better medical safeguarding in the loop again?
It's a good question.
Yeah, I think WPATH is a lost cause. Honestly, yeah. I don't see a pathway to reform, just given how, from the bottom to the top. There might be some individuals in the fringes that disagree, but they have no power. And as soon as anyone says anything from within, they just get shouted out and exiled from the organization. Yeah. It's as close to total ideological capture, I think, as you can possibly get within these things. They took out like age limits, and they put in a chapter on eunuchs in their most recent standards of care.
Awesome. Eunuch is a fetish. Just so people know, it is. So yes.
If they could do that and not bat an eye and just be like, why wouldn't we have a chapter on eunuchs? It just shows the degree, how far gone they are. So I would hope that this type of medicine just takes place under the umbrella of the medical organizations we already have, APA, Endocrine Society, things like that. I don't know if we need a specific organization, because it just turns into an activist advocacy organization that departs from evidence, because it's whatever the evidence happens to say. Well, they're representing people who want access, not necessarily what's the best evidence-based medical care that's out there.
I hope this isn't an overshare, but I have such a love-hate relationship with Marcy Bowers, who did my vaginoplasty, because on one hand, she did something that made my life so much better, so incredibly much better, made it possible for me to get married and date straight men and have a really good life. And so I saw the way that she fought at the hospital to get her trans patients care, and I'm so personally thankful for her. But then on the other, I've seen the way she's overseen the fall of this institution that had so much potential to make my life better and everyone else's life better. And she's just a failed leader. And I'm so torn about this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I totally understand.
That's how I feel too. We're I just see people who, claim to be supporting us. And I think whenever these people, whether they be in the Democratic Party or the medical establishment, whenever they stand by bad science or refuse to engage with reality, that is such a poison pill. And eventually that is going to come and wreak havoc, because you cannot win against reality. And the larger the gap between ideology and reality, the harder that snap will be when eventually things come crashing together. And so I just don't think there's any way through this that doesn't involve a totally honest discussion. And it's frustrating for sure.
Yeah, that's why we're here. That's why we're here with you, Colin. Reality's Last Stand. You've been on that project for a while, and it's true. It's interesting, all the groups that caught up in it. And honestly, to me, that GenSpect is the direct result almost of WPATH failing. That's something we're all seeing here. And there's been controversy after controversy. And I just hope that we can come to a stance that shows the medical efficacy of transition for the right individuals while protecting the vulnerable and the people who aren't the right individuals. If there was one thing I took away from the GenSpect conference, it was the voices of those detransitioners that have been harmed by this. And it's we got to pay attention to them, and we got to understand the limits of really gender care at all, and just understand that we got to be balanced and nuanced in how we approach this and be data driven. And that's something I've always personally appreciated with your platform, because I do see you really diving in to the data as opposed to the ideology.
Yeah.
So speaking of science, I wanted to give you an option. My husband has a PhD in bacterial genetics and spent, I believe, over 25 years working in drug development. And we thought it would be fun to make sure we're ending the show with some good vibes to have him come in and give you a little bit of a game show. So are you up for that at all?
Oh God, am I going to be quizzed on biology right now? Oh, my God.
On biology.
I've been out of the field for a little while, but yeah, let's do it. Hopefully they're more evolution oriented.
Hello, Frank.
Oh God.
Hi there. Hi.
It's being sprung on here.
Hi, Dr. Wright. Hi. My name is Dr. Frank Wu. I'm Brianna's husband, and I would like to say hello to you, scientist to scientist. So as Brianna mentioned, I have a PhD in molecular biology. You have a PhD in social insects and arthropods, which I find fascinating. And sometime we should just sit down and just talk about that stuff, because that's awesome.
Yeah. I love talking about that stuff. I never get to anymore. So
I'm writing a science fiction, a military science fiction novel about humans versus a society of killer space centipedes. So, social arthropods is anyway, we're off topic. Anyway, so your PhD is from UC Santa Barbara. Go Gauchos. Mine is from University of Wisconsin. Go Badgers. We have a bye week this week. And if you are game to be in a little game, I would like to invite you to a brand new segment of Dollcast that I would like to call Science Blinded by Science.
I'm down.
Do you see what I have to deal with all the time?
This is what you deal with off camera.
I regret transition entirely. I take it all back.
I have no idea what happened in the show before I showed up. I assume this is like a...
Yes.
I'm just continuing the happy, joyful energy.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
So, actually, Schyler, if you would like to be volunteered to be scorekeeper, it'll be really easy. I will ask progressively harder questions.
Okay.
And as Dr. Wright answers them, he will get progressively more and more points, and thereby glory and honor. All right, question number 1. Proteins include enzymes. 80% of muscles are muscle mass is protein. Proteins are made of amino acids. Question number 1 for Dr. Wright. Okay. What is the amino acid represented by the single letter abbreviation R? And if you need a hint, I can give it to you. R. Amino acid R.
The pirate acid.
I don't know.
It is. I'm asking about
Arginine.
Yes! Oh my God!
Oh, there we go.
Are you sure? that is right.
Yes.
20 points. 20 points for question number 1. 20 out of 20. Excellent. Good job. Okay. Question number 2. What is the central dogma of molecular biology?
Well, that's the link between. Let's see that.
You got.
So yeah. No, I know that it's that all the selection is based on like random mutation creating different types of proteins, and that can basically explain like all the evolutionary. It's the link between the genetics creating proteins that get selected for. This basically is that sort of the central dogma.
If I had asked the question, what is genetic evolution, I would have given you 20 points. But I actually the central dogma, which is a little different.
I don't know if I can formally put it. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you this. What is the relationship between DNA, RNA, and protein? Go.
So DNA, it creates the RNA, so it binds with it, and then the RNA then goes out and makes the proteins.
There you go.
Through the ribosome.
That's exactly it. DNA makes DNA.
Okay.
Makes
So
RNA,
that's the
makes-
central dogma is DNA to RNA to protein.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
So let's give him.
I've been out of it for a little while.
No,
We're cheering for you, Colin.
I used to teach this to my
We're
students.
rooting for you. Dollcast wants you to pull this out. Come on.
Yeah.
Oh, no, see, he's the molecular biologist here, so he spends his time. I spend my time poking ants and bees and wasps.
Okay. Well. Okay. So let me give you like 12 points out of like whatever for that second question. All right. Okay. I am full of questions, but I'm also like inquisitive myself. So for 10 points, tell me something that I might not know about bees. And I'll give you 10 points if I didn't know
That
it.
you might not know.
Yes.
Do you know that they do a certain dance on their hive, and the angle that they do their dance on a vertical hive has to do with the flat angle of where this in relation to the sun is where their next hive is going to be, or where their next flower patch is going to be?
I actually
the waggle dance.
I did know that. But tell me something else I don't know.
Let's see. With bees, how about wasps? Because I study wasps.
Okay,
more.
wasps. No, that's fine.
Yeah. Do you know that wasp queens, their personality is related to the personality of their entire hive? Like you can predict the way a hive behaves at a group level
That's so
based
cool.
on the personality of the founding queen who founds it early on in the year.
Like what kind of? Because I know like one of your papers is on like the personality of like groups of organisms as opposed to like individual, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by the personality of wasps?
Yeah, tell us more about
So this is actually what part of my PhD specifically was on spiders, but I was doing like two PhDs side by side, and so to whichever one was best was going to be my dissertation. So mine was on. I did a lot of research on paper wasps, the solitary paper wasp that starts out with a single queen. It's a Polistes metricus. It's a paper wasp, and basically you can predict the behavior of the entire colony that comes out months later that she founds by just knowing the behavior of the founding queen. And not only that, you can find out how the colony is likely to survive in nature based on the colony's personality. So queens that are really bold and stay on their nests for long and defend their nests give rise to colonies that actually are less likely to attack intruders. The workers are less likely to fly off, but queens that are more likely to fly away when you're prodding them and antagonizing them are more likely to give rise to nests that have workers that will fly and swarm quickly at you when you pester them. And then colony survival is related to both queen, how bold they are, and also how large the queens are. So,
no analogies there to anything we've discussed today. Just nothing.
but that was one of my big discoveries, I guess, when I was a real working scientist. So
That is something that I know. So is there a way, theoretically, that someone could take that knowledge to make some kind of chemical or something to control wasp populations in like my house? Sting me and go like just like do their wasp thing without like over there without like bothering me.
it'd be, I was always, that was the worst part about writing grants, is because there wasn't a whole lot of like practical application for my research. It was just like, I thought it was really, really cool. And I would always
I made up all sorts of practical applications.
I would always try to make, I would always try to make some link to like colony collapse in bees, and if personalities occur in these wasps, and maybe the same things occur in bees, and then somehow with that knowledge we can protect the bees, or I would always say that in my grants, but at the end of the day I just wanted to play with wasps and stuff. So.
Okay, Colin.
Right, so go ahead, Taf.
Wait, no, I have a question. What's the chance that we can breed wasp queens to make like really friendly ones that create hives of like wasps that could be our pets?
Oh my God.
Like,
Wow.
You could probably select
my
for the
dream.
docile wasps. I think that there is a genetic component because their workers have
my goodness.
inherit their personalities. So, I guess there were some experimentals we wanted to follow up. I never got a chance to because I left academia, but I want to do these queen swap tests where, like, before the workers emerge, you put a different queen on the colony because the workers will work for whatever queen is there, and if they behave. See if the workers behave as though you predict based on their natal queen versus the replacement queen. So I never got to tease apart actually the genetic versus environmental factors.
Interesting.
That could be someone else's dissertation. If I had grad students,
You're
I'd
just
have
giving out free ideas.
Yeah.
And then whether the wasp give like an initial signal that sets everything in motion, or whether they give continuous biochemical signals.
Yeah. We'd
Like
have to find out.
maintain whatever. That maintain order as defined by the queen.
Yeah, you could do queen removals too. All kinds of there's so many things you
What
could
happens
do.
to the wasp?
Okay, Frank, I love you. I've been married to you for a long time.
Is there another choice?
I told you you had 5 minutes, not 500
I
minutes.
think we did. Look, I'm gonna give him an extra 15 points for that because that was just fascinating.
We learned.
So how many points is that, Schyler?
Oh gosh, let me sum that
I
up.
think it was like
Have we been keeping track?
I have
12,
57 points.
57, a brand new record
Hell
for
yes.
our segment, Science, Blinded by Science, which is all about the joy and wonder and diversity and and exceptions to rules and like all sorts of like complications that you wouldn't expect in science and biology.
I hope you guys have other scientists on so I can see how I measure up there.
I've never seen 57 before. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's a truly astounding amount of points. So anyway, so that was fun. So
Thank you. Frank.
Yeah.
what?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
I
for
like that
having
you. So I just want to note this. I love that Frank positioned his camera so you see his saber-tooth tiger,
That's amazing.
his
Yeah.
tank, his Sky Striker, and his
love it.
Lego version of what is that? The thing
the Lego.
from,
No, wait. It's over there.
Giga Horse
The
from
Lego version of the Giga Horse, which I
amazing.
built myself.
Just showing off.
From scratch. So I'm very,
Good job,
very
Frank.
proud of that.
That's awesome.
And then
job,
above
Frank.
on top, we can see Woolando, which is our little Lego city. And yeah, well, I wanted an interesting zoom back.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you everybody for
Thank
having
you.
me.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thank
Dr.
you.
Wright.
Thank you so much. I'm going to get dunked on by people for flubbing the central dog.
We'll edit all the ones you missed out.
Yeah, exactly.
And again,
Potatoes.
science is full of wonder, complications, exceptions, and glory and funness. So anyway,
Amazing. All right,
peace.
bye, Frank.
Thanks, Frank. So you have a very,
wasn't
you have
too
a very
awkward.
entertaining
Oh,
home life. You must.
He's crazy. He's
Quite
wild.
a character. Luckily,
Yeah, he's
Christine is
he's
pretty-
willing to
pretty
marry a
subdued.
trans woman, so you can see the adventurous spirit that led
Yeah.
to
He's
that.
so
definitely.
sweet. Yeah.
Isn't he?
Yeah.
I love him. I think he's good.
He's fun.
Thank you, Colin.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you for
thank you,
coming.
Colin,
Yeah.
for coming
This was
on
great.
the show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, this was a lot of fun. I'm glad to be here. I had messages from people. They're like, "You're going to go on there. It's going to be I don't know. They're going to try to get you on stuff, and it's going to be nothing but hostile." But this was fantastic.
No.
Yeah, but it's like I know at least some of the people on there. It's fine. We can talk and.
Yeah.
I was definitely trying to find like things we could disagree on.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was like, oh God, I'm going to end up agreeing with everything. I have
Yeah,
to.
well, I know some of your viewers on Twitter. They were saying I was like basically the devil. So I hope after watching this, I am a little more humanized to them. That
Yes.
I'm not your enemy. At least I hope. So,
I mean, I can say this. Look, you've always gendered me correctly. You've been totally nice to me in back channel. I mean, yeah, I don't think you're the enemy. I think we share an assessment on the dangers of what I think you call woke ideology. 100% like it's not serving anyone. And, you know, I'm not with you on a total ban for minors, but I think other than that, there's a lot of shared energy. You know, I think at the end of the day, all of us want the same thing here, and that is a better system for trans people, minors and adults to transition under. Yeah, I think all of us agree this highly politicized system is serving no one.
yeah. And I think all of your voices are incredibly important here, more so than mine, because people don't listen to me because I'm just
I don't think that's true.
cis, white, whatever person who's studying bugs.
Gosh.
Yeah, I think we need you on our side.
Yeah, we need you too. It's all
I'll
team
be
effort.
supplemental. Okay.
Yay.
Team effort for sure.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank
This
you,
was a lot of fun.
Colin.
Thank you.
Should we move on to topic 3? I feel like we have a lot to go through here. So